Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 280. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, August the 13th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. The topic of today's podcast, we're going to go way back and talk about, for me anyway, what was really the first paranormal / conspiracy theory / political statement that I remember making the headlines and becoming fairly mainstream. And that's cattle mutilations. Okay. The first time I heard about the whole cattle mutilation phenomenon was back in the would have been late 60s, probably early 70s, when I would listen to Jim White, the Big Bumper, on KMOX in the evening. And he was a talk show host. If you're not at least 50 years old, you probably don't remember him. Maybe 45, you probably don't remember him. But he was one of the first guys, at least in the area that I know of, that talked about stuff that others didn't talk about. He wasn't Art Bell, he wasn't George Norrie, but occasionally he would have stories about cattle mutilations and UFOs and ghosts and things like that. And we're going to talk about cattle mutilations and when they first became mainstream. This wasn't in the 90s or the 80s. This was actually in the late 60s and early 1970s when the whole cattle mutilation phenomenon started off big. So that's the topic of today's podcast: cattle mutilations, paranormal, or politics. But before we get into that, two topics I wanted to discuss. I guess this is kind of a bitch session for me. Maybe the first one is, maybe the second one is just a scratching my head and not understanding the way things work nowadays, which is kind of becoming a pattern with me. I think maybe the older I get, the more things change, the more I scratch my head and wonder why they're changing this way. And I understand that things change. I understand that different people from different generations think in a different way. The greatest generation that trained me certainly saw things differently than I do. And the newest generations see things differently than I do. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it certainly is different. And we'll get to that too. The first one, the city of St. Louis. Now, it's interesting because I spent this week with a customer in rural Idaho, of all places. And beautiful part of the country, interesting part of the country. But when they ask you where you're from, I say St. Louis. Now, I actually live about 35 miles east of St. Louis, but the St. Louis metropolitan area. If I told them Lake St. Louis, they'll say, well, Lake St. Louis, where's that? Is that near St. Louis? The answer is yes. Okay, so you solve a lot of problems. I said, yeah, I live near St. Louis, okay? But there's St. Louis and there's St. Louis. There's the city of St. Louis and there's everything else. And to be fair, there are parts of the city of St. Louis, and then there are other parts of the city of St. Louis. But let's talk about the city of St. Louis by itself. It could be so much. In my whole life, people have said, wow, the city could be so much, but it's just not. Same song, 27,000th verse. Schnucks, who, those of you who don't know, those of you who are not from this area, is a local regional grocery store chain. Definitely one of the biggest, maybe the biggest. I mean, there's Schnucks stores in Missouri, Illinois, I think Kansas. I've seen one in Indiana even. Schnucks is a big deal. They've been around for a long time. They serve the community and they make a lot of money from the community, so it's a give and take. But there's a Schnucks store in South City, and Schnucks is called on the city of St. Louis to help resolve a problem that they have in the area. And around the store, they have trash, discarded clothing, and a strong odor of human waste. They're common outside the store, and it affects the people who walk into the store. So what did Schnooks do? Well, they sent a letter to the city of St. Louis officials, including Mayor Tashara Jones, Alderwoman Megan Aaliyah Green from Ward 15, that's where the store resides, the city's Director of Human Services, the Director of Public Safety, and the Director of Health to outline a plan for change. According to Bill Bradley, who's Schnook's Chief Marketing Director and Communications Officer, he said last year alone, Schnook spent more than $500,000 on security measures. Says the company will continue to pay for security camera surveillance on the parking lot. They provide an on-site security guard. They pay for a police officer to be there, okay? And Bradley says Schnooks will also partner with the city behavioral health specialist to address issues like mental health and drug abuse near the store. Okay, all these people do is they have a store in the neighborhood, and this is all that they're doing just to help out. Now, what are they asking the city to do? Two things. In the letter, it asks the city of St. Louis to assist, saying the city hasn't been providing monthly street cleaning, which is required. They're also asked the city to add garbage cans to the sidewalks along the store. Okay, all this that Schnooks is doing, and they're saying, can you help us out here by putting up a couple of trash cans on the sidewalk and cleaning the street once a month? Their answer? A resounding no. City officials are urging Schnooks to join a community improvement district where businesses contract for the added services on their own, through a small property tax, of course. In other words, you're paying to have trash cans and street cleaning. But if you really want it, you're going to have to pay twice. Schnooks may have to give a little, said Alderwoman Green. We may have to give a little, but the community is really rallying around finding a solution. The store is very integral to the neighborhood. I think there are ways that we can improve. Mayor Tashara Jones and Alderwoman Green. Let me share something with you about Mayor Tashara Jones. Well, first, this came from her public information officer, Nick Dunn. Mr. Dunn said, the city of St. Louis has invested $15.5 million in ARPA funds towards expanding community violence and intervention programs. And they go on and on and on and on and on. Schnooks isn't asking for anything like that. Schnooks is saying, can you clean the street once a month and put up a couple of trash cans on the sidewalk? And they've just said no. Now, let me share something with you about Mayor Tashara Jones. She runs the city of St. Louis. She's the mayor. The city has received over $500 million in COVID money and Stan Kroenke money from the settlement from the Rams leaving St. Louis going to Los Angeles. $500 million. Where's that money going? They can't clean the streets once a month and put up a couple of trash cans? They've just said, no, we want more money from you. We're not going to do this. I'm going to be a bit of an ass here, okay? But Mayor Tashara Jones is ruining that city. She's ruining that city. $500 million. What have you done with that money? Let me ask a quick question of the mayor. Are you maybe conferring with your father on how to spend that money? Who, if you don't know, was Vervis Jones, the city controller, I believe was his title, one of many. Oh, by the way, he went to prison for stealing money. Now, I think he's out of prison for stealing money. I'm pretty sure he's out of prison. He might still be there, but I think he's out of prison for stealing money, okay? I think he is. Is Mayor Jones consulting her dad on what to do with that money? Because she's certainly not spending it on cleaning the street once a month, and putting up a couple of trash cans. City of St. Louis could be so much, but they continue to suck with a capital S. Something else I came across this week, and I had to scratch my head, and it's a new term, and new terms happen all the time. And this has to do with younger people, and these are people who are under 30, not taking their job as seriously as they could. And the term is called quiet quitting. What is quiet quitting, you ask? Well, the phrase is generating millions of views on TikTok. as some young professionals reject the idea of going above and beyond in their careers, labeling their lesser enthusiasm as a form of quitting. It isn't about getting off the company payroll, these employees say. In fact, the idea is to stay on the payroll, but focus your time on the things that you do outside the office. In other words, effing off at work. Now, the TikTok videos range from sincere ideas about work-life balance to snarky jokes. Now, some set firm boundaries against overtime in favor of family, which isn't bad. Others advocate coasting from 9 to 5, doing just enough to get by. Now, of course, every generation enters the workforce and quickly realizes that having a job isn't all fun and games. I mean, how many times have I had, look, it's a job, J-O-B. It's not vacation. It's not free time. It's not goofing off with your buddies. It's not sack time with mama. It's a job. It can be pleasant, but you're there to make money for your boss so he can take some of that money and give it to you and you can do your thing, okay? Now, the difference now is that this group has TikToks and hashtags, the younger folks, that is, and these 20-somethings have joined the workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic, and things were different. Blurred boundaries between work and life. Working from home. Many workers say they feel they have the power to push back because of the current strong labor market. In fact, recent Gallup polls show that employee engagement is declining. Now, in all generations. Now, across generations, U.S. employee engagement is falling, according to a survey data from Gallup. But Gen Zs and younger millennials born in 1989 and after reported the lowest engagement during the first quarter at 31%. That's a lot. Okay. Now, Jim Harder, who's the chief scientist for Gallup's workplace and well-being research, said workers' descriptions of quiet quitting align with large groups of survey respondents that he classifies as not engaged. Those who will show up to work and do the minimum required, but nothing else. More than half the workers surveyed by Gallup were born after 1989. 54%. So basically, of the slackers that are out there, more than half were born after 1989. That, friends, is a lot. Now, one factor Gallup uses to measure engagement is whether people feel their work has purpose. Younger employers report they don't feel that way, the data shows. And these people who are more likely to work passively and look out for themselves over their employers. Now, Paige West, she's 24, said she stopped overextending herself at a former position as a transportation analyst in Washington, D.C., less than a year into the job. Work stress had gotten so intense, she said, that her hair was falling out and she couldn't sleep. While looking for a new role, she's no longer worked beyond the 40 hours each week. She didn't sign up for extra training, and she stopped trying to socialize with colleagues. I took a step back. I'm just going to work the hours. I'm just going to work, and then I'm going to get paid. Besides, I'm not going to do anything extra. Well, Ms. West said she found herself more engaged during the meetings once she stopped trying so hard, and she received more positive feedback. She did leave the job last year. She's now a full-time freelance assistant, making about 75% of her previous salary. She adjusted by moving back to her home state in Florida. Now, let's stop and think about this for a minute. There's being a total slacker, and there's letting the job get to you. Now, if you're working so hard that your hair is falling out, that's a problem. But I will find, and I speak from experience, that quite often it's not the job, it's how you approach the job. And the longer you do a job, the more you find ways to do the job. What's the old term? Work smarter, not harder. Okay. So maybe if you find yourself very stressed at work, don't just be a slacker, but try to work smarter and not harder. Now, some online commentators pledge to relax on social media when they have downtime at work. Others say they follow their job descriptions to the letter and they never ask for extra assignments. People who coast have been fixtures in the office for decades, but many of today's less invested employees have been able to skate by thanks to remote work. That's the whole working at home thing. And I've said that for a long time. The whole working from home thing. Some people work from home. Some people are just at home collecting the paycheck. Now, Josh Bittinger, he's a 32-year-old market analyst director and management consulting at a management consulting company, said people who stumble onto the phrase quiet quitting may assume it encourages people to be lazy, but it actually reminds them not to work to the point of burnout, which is smart. Now, after years of saying yes to everything, in hopes of standing out, Mr. Bittinger said he's learned to say no more, reserve evenings for himself, and avoids checking emails on vacation. That's different than quiet quitting, okay? I've got my job done, my project's done, I'm performing well, and I'm getting good feedback, and I'm able to take time to just step away from everything. Okay, all this is well and good because of the market that we're in. A lot of these 20-somethings, what they have never seen are tough times in the job section, the job. Right now, and for quite some time now, employees have the upper hand. And this is an ebb and flow thing, okay? It's going to change. Times are going to get tougher. And what's the first thing that companies do when times get tougher? They cut staff, okay? And this is all well and good, and no one should stress out until their hair falls out, okay? And your job title should not define you. That said, if you do the minimum, if you do just enough not to get fired, you, my friend, will be the first laid off. You will be the last to be promoted, and you will not rise within your corporation. That's a fact, and that's your choice. And if you decide to be a quiet quitter, don't start crying alligator tears when the tide turns and you find yourself on the outside looking in. Okay, we're done with that. Let's talk about cattle mutilations, okay? I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, once upon a time, and his hours always change. Sometimes they started as early as 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Sometimes they didn't start till midnight. Sometimes they went until midnight. Sometimes he was on till 3 in the morning, okay? But his name was Jim White, the Big Bumper. He would talk about paranormal stuff on his radio talk show on KMOX, the voice of St. Louis, 50,000 red hot watts, on a regular basis. Not always, not exclusively, but once or twice a month it would come up. And cattle mutilations was a big topic that always interested me, okay? What are cattle mutilations? Well, those are the dead cattle that are found in ranches, usually out west. The cattle were dead. They've been surgically cut open. Their organs were removed. Their eyeballs were removed. The animals, the scavengers like coyotes and buzzards would not eat them. And there was no explanation. There were no footprints around these animals. Now, normally, and the sources for this essay, by the way, are Modern Farmer Magazine, the History Channel website, and encyclopedia.com. Normally, unexpected death of cattle is a financial burden for farmers, of course. And it may be an emotional burden because of the ranchers that own them. But there are some cattle death stories which gained fame dating back to 1967 that aren't ordinary deaths. One of the first times, television station KTVZ in Crook County, Oregon, said the sheriff's office was investigating the death of several cattle. Now, that looked like an ordinary story, but it wasn't. In fact, these particular types of deaths referred to as cattle mutilations, and they have very strange conspiracy-ridden histories. They have certain things in common. The cattle will be missing certain body parts, typically genitals or eyes. There will be cuts described as surgical in their unusual neatness. The cattle will not have displayed signs of illness prior to their sudden demise. And no blood at all. Now, these cattle mutilation stories first gained fame in 1967. That's a long time ago, folks. So this is nothing new. And although that initial case in Oregon actually involved a horse rather than a cow or a bull, stories of cattle mutilations bubbled up from across the American West through the 1970s, and the FBI actually conducted an investigation, which was inconclusive. Shocking. They did find some stuff in the autopsies that seemed odd. Absence of copper in the liver, for example. Now, the FBI investigation includes theories ranging from the cattle were dropped from a helicopter to they were injected with anticoagulants, hence the loss of blood or lack of blood. The stories gained some fame once in a while. There'd be a big fun feature in a magazine. One of the first ones was in 1975 when Alexander Cockburn ran a story in Esquire magazine about cattle mutilations. That's kind of when it became mainstream. Okay. Conspiracy theories ran rampant, and they covered just about all the usual bases. Aliens, chupacabras, satanic cult, and of course, government cover-ups. Now, there's also, of course, the skeptic's explanation. The precise surgical cuts have been demonstrated in experiments to be found when a dead cow bloats, tearing the skin neatly. Some insect scavengers like blowflies tend to go for the eyes and genitals because these are soft portals to the inside of the animal. In any case, the newest cases involve 3 or possibly 4 head of cattle where the sheriff's department said it had certain body parts removed. That was the Oregon case back in 1967. Now, extra patrols in the rural area were provided, and the mutilation followed others scattered throughout eastern Oregon. No arrests have been made. Not in 1975. Not now. And it goes on. In fact, bovine corpses stunned the ranchers who found them. The animals' ears, eyes, udders, anuses, sex organs, and tongues had been routinely removed. Something with a sharp, clean instrument was used. Their carcasses had been drained of blood. No tracks, no footprints were found in the immediate vicinity, nor were there any unusual opportunistic scavengers. In fact, the scavengers wouldn't touch them. That was consistent. Normally when something dies, the buzzards get it, the coyotes get it, raccoons, possums. None of these would touch it. Now, between April and October of 1975, nearly 200 cases of cattle mutilations were reported in the state of Colorado alone. Far from being mere tabloid fodder, it had become a nationally recognized issue. That year, the Colorado Associated Press voted it the state's #1 story. That's a big deal. And one of the senators from Colorado, Floyd Haskell, he asked the FBI to get involved. Now, throughout the 1970s, cases had continued to mount throughout the American heartland. And in 1979, after thousands of reported cattle mutilations were reported, causing millions of dollars of livestock losses, the FBI finally opened an investigation into a series of cases that had reportedly taken place in New Mexico's Indian lands. Pressure came in part from a heated public symposium on the subject that had been convened by the state's science-minded U.S. Senator. That's Senator Harrison Schmitt. Now, this was no normal U.S. senator. Harrison Schmitt had a Ph.D. in geology from Harvard. Oh, also, he was an astronaut and walked on the moon as part of the Apollo 17 mission. That's who was all in on this story. Ultimately, the FBI's inquiry poured cold water on the idea that something strange was afoot, of course. In fact, on January 15, 1980, the Bureau closed the investigation, putting out a statement saying none of the reported cases had involved what appeared to be mutilations by anything other than common predators. Of course not. Now, who sharply disagreed? How about all the locals? Sheriff George Yarnell of Elbert County in Colorado said, "I've been around cattle all my life, and I can sure tell whether it's been done by a coyote or a sharp instrument." You'd think he would know, right? Now, mysterious livestock mutilations weren't confirmed in the 1970s or to the United States. The 70s cases, however, brought the most widespread attention. Okay? Now, broadly speaking, the debate about cattle mutilation falls into 2 camps. Those who see the mutilations as unexplained phenomenon, and those that see them as normal cattle deaths, repackaged as something mysterious and paranormal. Now, for those in the unexplained camp, opinions have diverged about the possible explanation. Some law enforcement communities opined that the animals were being mutilated by people in strange, quasi-religious rituals. In fact, in 1980, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police blamed the mutilations on an unidentified cult. The Department of Criminal Investigations in Iowa, meantime, asserted that the mutilations were being conducted by Satanists. Reports within the affected ranching communities indicated that the mutilations regularly coincided with the sightings of mysterious, unmarked helicopters. Some ranchers who suffered the worst losses believed the federal government had performed the mutilations for an assortment of reasons, including the testing of biological weaponry. Anonymously for the government, they proved so heated that the Nebraska National Guard ordered their helicopters to cruise at 2,000 feet rather than 1,000 feet. The reason? For their safety, because the ranchers started shooting at the helicopters. Now, others have blamed unidentified earthbound creatures. For example, at Skinwalker Ranch in northeastern Utah, rancher Terry Sherman lost several head of cattle to mutilations after buying 512-acre property in 1996 on the ranch. Now, those mutilations coincided with several strange encounters. In one, Sherman saw a wolf-like creature 3 times the size of a normal wolf that was impervious to his rifle fire. In other words, he shot the wolf and it didn't hurt him. Now, in another, a researcher said he saw odd humanoid creatures with piercing yellow eyes spying on him from a tree. And other cases have happened on the Skinwalker Ranch property as well. Now, still, others tie the mutilations to possible extraterrestrial visitors. Filmmaker, science reporter, Stanford-educated author, and frequent guest on Coast to Coast, Linda Moulton Howe, has looked at more than 1,000 animal mutilation cases. In fact, she won an Emmy Award for those efforts with her 1980 documentary, A Strange Harvest. In 1989, a follow-up book called An Alien Harvest, Further Evidence Linking Animal Mutilations and Human Abductions to Alien Life Forms, Howe ultimately concluded, after researching hundreds of more cases, that extraterrestrials were likely involved in the cattle mutilations. Again, Linda Moulton Howe is not your standard conspiracy theorist. She won an Emmy Award for her documentary. Okay? Now, one particularly compelling case linking animal mutilations and aliens involved Lady. Lady was a horse who was found dead and partially skinned at a ranch in Alamosa, Colorado in September 1967. Again, the first mutilation case. Now, within 24 hours of the incident, in which the animal's brain, lungs, heart, and thyroid were cleanly cut out, local Superior Court Judge Charles Bennett witnessed 3 orange rings in the sky, flying in a triangular formation at incredible speeds. 2 sheriff's deputies, meanwhile, reported being followed around by a floating orange globe. Okay, again, 2 sheriff's deputies and a Superior Court judge are saying this, not the drunk guy at the bar. And there is some skepticism within the veterinarian world, actually, okay, because there are skeptics. Some medical experts offer much more mundane explanations for animal mutilations. In fact, veterinary pathologists point to the point that when scavengers eat the soft tissue of a dead animal first, that might explain the missing external organs commonly described on the dead bovine. Bloodlessness, meanwhile, might be attributed to livor mortis. When the animal dies, the heart stops, the blood stops circulating, thus settling the blood via gravity and creating a bloodless effect in some surface parts of the carcass. Is that an explanation? Maybe. Now, agricultural historian Michael Goldman theorizes that the 1970s reports of cattle mutilations likely provided the way for independent small-scale ranchers to express both their economic anxiety and the resentment from the government interference on agricultural life. Okay? And this is something worth considering. Now, according to Goldman, unexplained cattle deaths had always been part of ranching. Cattle deaths were no bigger year-to-date during the time of reported mutilations than earlier before. So in other words, the same amount of cattle were dying, only now they were reporting mutilations. Now, Most of the mutilation reports emerged at a time when the cattle industry was reeling. In the 1970s, if you remember, and I do, the U.S. government sent a lot of grain to food insecure nations. That drove up the domestic price of cattle feed. At that time also, President Nixon intermittently froze the price of beef domestically to combat inflation. So the cattle ranchers found themselves in a squeeze. They had to pay more for food, and they couldn't raise the price of their product. And in a 1975 Senate Agricultural Committee hearing, the president of the American National Cattlemen's Association said the industry had suffered operating losses of $5 billion, plus a reduction of inventory valued at $20 billion. Now, as evidence for his argument, Goldman points out that the alleged 1970s cattle mutilations occurred most frequently in states like Colorado and New Mexico, which had a higher percentage of small ranches, most vulnerable to those government policies. Texas, meanwhile, reported considerably less of the phenomenon, despite having far more cattle in the country. Now, because these mutilations were concentrated both geographically and over time, Goldman said paranormal activity seems a less likely explanation than a case of simple mass hysteria. And that could make sense. But if there were satanic cults or the government or UFOs involved or chupacabras involved, you would think they would prey on the ones that are more rural and out of the way of eyesight than the ones that are located in a large ranch with lots of activity. You would think, okay? Now, this just didn't happen in Colorado. In fact, in 1974, there were reports of cattle mutilations in northeastern Nebraska and in eastern South Dakota. Now, some reports coincided with sightings of UFOs. Also, the absence of footprints and other tracks in the area. There were rumors of large helicopters being used for cattle rustling. Now, although modern rustlers do often use mechanization, like helicopters, it's unlikely they would leave the carcasses behind, because if they did, there's no rationale for mutilating individual cattle. I mean, why would they do that if they're looking to steal the cattle? Okay, so on the surface that made sense, but you dig deeper and it really didn't. Now, some explanations were, they weren't really wholly convincing, let's just say that. In fact, the director of men's admission at the South Dakota State Mental Hospital suggested that the mutilations were work of a psychotic individual, perhaps a youth from a farm background with hostility towards authority figures. A persuasive suggestion was that the mutilations were the work of a satanic cult, and a few scattered cases of animals who had been drugged, because a few scattered cases of animals who had been drugged were found. However, the cattle mutilations covered a large area and continued undetected for months, and the possibility of satanic groups operating from helicopters over a large area kind of seemed unlikely, okay? So it didn't really make sense. Now, in spite of this lack of evidence, reports of cattle mutilations and unfounded charges that aliens were attacking hundreds of thousands of the defenseless cows continued to circulate within some of the UFO networks, okay? Now, the modern-day reports of animal mutilations are not unprecedented. Other stories of attacks on cattle have been around for a long time. So, did it start in 1967? No, remember, I'm not saying that's when all this stuff started. I'm saying that's when I remember it starting, or remembering people talking about it. But I've always been intrigued with these stories that we think are new, but they're not. Same song, second verse. And there was one particular story. It was actually in Wales, in the UK, that I found particularly interesting. And to those FBI agents that say, nothing strange going on here, here's a case that's interesting. There was a guy by the name of Charles Fort. Charles Fort was a tireless chronicler of the bizarre once upon a time. And he had a book called Lo, L-O, exclamation point. Now, Ford recalls that in that one winter during an outbreak of a religious revivalism in Wales, there were stories of strange lights in the air and mysterious air vessels, followed by reports of widespread attacks on sheep. Now, later, sheep were killed in a large scale by something that attacked half a dozen of them each night. Rabbits were killed by having their backs broken. There have been many similar reports of animal mutilations from other countries besides just the U.S. and Wales. Okay, so you think to yourself, okay, Strong, well, here's more stuff. It's just copycat stuff. Not so much, because Charles Fort's book called Low was published, friends, dear listeners, in 1931. The stories of the strange lights in the air and the mysterious air vessels happened between 1904 and 1905. The Wright brothers didn't even fly their first plane until 1903. The sheep kills were in 1910. Now, these are the same stories by the same people with the same reasons. We saw airships. We saw UFOs. This is in 1904, 1905, and 1910. They saw airships. Okay? Same stories, same mystery, different time, different place. And that's why so many of these people believe that these cattle mutilations were caused by extraterrestrials, were caused by UFOs. Look at what we do. We go into the ocean, we go out into the wilderness, and we tag fish. We do experiments on wolves, moose, etc. We look at them, we do some things to them, we tag them, and then we release them. And we can do that because we are so far superior to those animals. What if there are beings out there who are far superior to us? And they're doing things like looking at our food source and finding out what's going on with them. They kind of go hand in hand with the whole alien abduction thing, okay? Except for the cattle are found dead and mutilated, and the people are just released. Maybe it is extraterrestrial. Maybe it is other beings from someplace else saying, you know what? We understand these humans are more like us, so we're not going to kill them. We're just going to experiment them. But the cattle, not so much. We can go ahead and do what we want with them. I still remember the story, and I've mentioned this many, many times on my podcast. And this was a story, I'm going to say this was a Fort Worth, Texas newspaper talking about a UFO that crashed into a tower. It was a spacecraft that crashed into a tower, and beings were found. They've buried these beings in a grave. That grave is still there, and this was in the newspaper. And it was in the 1890s, before there really were any flying machines, except for balloons, of course. So these stories have been around for a long, long time. Now, could some of them just be a farmer trying to make a story? Sure. When you have 5, 10, 15, 20, but thousands over decades, maybe longer, you still have to, when you look at it that way, dear listener, you have to scratch your head and say, you know, this doesn't make sense. And the whole explanation of the FBI, well, we've experimented on this, or we've investigated this, I should say, and we found nothing's wrong. Yeah. And we all believe that story. Now, don't we? Well, that's it. I'm done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's my email address. Send me an email address. I do answer my emails. Thank you, by the way, for all of you that sent emails on podcast number 279. Lots of good reporting from that, or lots of good feedback from that. And I do answer my emails. If you want the podcast to be delivered to your mailbox, JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. Tell me what you want. I'll download it, send you the link, and you can download it and listen to it at your leisure. If you don't want to do that, just find the James Strong Show wherever you find your podcasts. And share with friends, please. You got a buddy? Send the email to Link. Say, hey, listen to this knothead. He's not half bad. I would appreciate that as well. That's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.